welcome you here, I think, and congratulate you actually for being selected for us. This is really one of those events and that the FMA does that I'm really fond of. I think it's a great event, and I encourage you to make full use of your time here in Nashville and to get to know the profession and how it works and people in it. I also thank Paul for inviting me to be part of this very distinguished panel. It's very flattering to be part of it, and hopefully I can say something useful in the next few minutes to help you along your way. So obviously the topic, as Paul mentioned, is the process of writing your papers with the goal, of course, of getting these papers published in the good journals and convincing editors and referees that you've done something useful. The writing part is a part that I think is not always everyone's favorite task when first starting out in this profession, but it's really critically important, and so hopefully I can say something that's useful in that respect. The way I tend to think about this is that it's all part of this transition that you make as a student from going from being a consumer of knowledge to ultimately a producer of that knowledge. And so if you think about your first couple of years in a typical PhD program, you're by and large a consumer of this knowledge. You're reading textbooks, you're doing problem sets on microeconomics, you're reading tons of papers. And as faculty, of course, our hope is that this is all preparation for you to be producers of knowledge. But we're realistic as well, and let's face it, when you all are reading these papers and doing these problems, you're not really thinking about becoming a producer of knowledge. You're thinking, how do I pass the comps at the end of my second year? And it's only once you get past that, passing those comps, and I think Vish referred to this earlier, that we just kind of turn you loose and say, okay, go out and find an idea. Do something original. And that's sort of when panic sets in. And you go through this process of searching for a topic, which is something that somebody else will talk about later. But this is where you become sort of a full-scale producer of knowledge. And your goal is really twofold in this process. First and foremost, you want to discover some new knowledge, but secondly, what I want to talk about is you've got to communicate this knowledge in a way that somehow maximizes its impact. You need to convince the profession that you've done something that really has expanded our base of knowledge, and that's where the writing part comes in. And that, as I said, is a part that sometimes doesn't receive the attention that it really deserves. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with students over the years in which you sort of pass them in the hallway and ask them questions about how their paper's coming along, and they'll spend a lot of time telling you about their process of collecting the data and what sort of regressions they're running on this, what sort of robustness tests that they're doing. And then they'll say something that basically communicates the fact that they haven't written a thing yet. And I said, but I should be able to do that over the weekend. I'll give it to you on Monday. Please, don't give it to me on Monday if that's the case. This process takes a lot of time. The writing part is difficult, and you really have to give it the same sort of attention that you give to the rest of the study in order for it to ultimately to work out. I'm sure everybody up here has been in this process of writing and rewriting drafts of papers and single paragraphs time and time again. It's a difficult process that really requires your attention. So how do you do it? If you're sitting here today, we've had references to you having a 70-page job market paper that somehow has got to be condensed down into a 30-page paper that might be acceptable to a journal. How do you go about this particular process? Well, the temptation is to think about it in terms of cutting and pasting. Say, well, I'm just going to take out this part, this part, this part. That'll get me down to 30 pages. I'd encourage you not to take that approach. So what you really want to do, I think, is to start completely over with the motivation and the introduction of your paper. I'm going to talk a little bit more about introduction in a couple of minutes, but you really want to ask yourself, what's really the central contribution of this study that I just spent 2 or 3 years of my life on? Right? It may not be the central contribution that you thought it was going to be when you first started this project. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think the way most final defenses go is that, first of all, the faculty is just signing off that yes, you've done enough to get your degree. But the second part of the discussion at that final defense is always, okay, what's really important in this paper and what's not? You want to know that coming out of the final defense so you can now build your paper around it. And that's why I think it's important to do. You basically throw out your old introduction. You start blank with a blank slate and write up the motivation and the introduction of the paper as if you were starting the paper over. When my former colleague, John McConnell, was fond of telling the students, just dump it in the trash can and start over. He said, now you've learned everything you should have done. Now you've learned what your study is really about, so write it up based on what you know now, not what you did before. Right? And as you're writing that study, you really want it to be conveyed in a linear fashion to the reader. And again, the temptation is that it won't be linear, but rather it will be chronological. Because you started this project, you talked to various faculty along the way that said, maybe you should try this, or you should do this sort of test, and you do those things, and you just keep adding them on to what you already had, right? And it's just listed out in a chronological fashion along with dissertations. That's not the way you want your paper to read. Right? Once you've identified what your paper is really about and what the central contribution is, you want it to read as if, okay, here's the question, I'm at point A, I want to go to point B, point C in a very linear fashion. I don't want to be this doesn't need to be a way in which you convey to the reader all the pain you went through to write the study and the order in which you went through that pain. Right? You want to just convey it to them in a way that they learn something, and that's best learned in more of a linear fashion rather than a chronological fashion. The way you want to think about this is more like a newspaper article rather than a mystery novel. A newspaper article, if you think about the first paragraph of a newspaper article, it tells you most of what you need to know about what happened in that event. That's the way your study should be. You got to hit the reader pretty early with what your central contribution is. Don't leave them hanging. You're not writing a mystery novel in which you tease them with little pieces of information, waiting for the big bang at the end of the paper. That's not the way it works. Another thing you really have to get a feel for is learning how to write in a tight fashion. Right? And this is always a little bit hard thing to explain. It's one of those things that you kind of know it when you see it, and you'll get this comment a lot. This has to be tighter. What do you mean by that? What's it to be tighter? Right? So I was trying to think, well, can I give an example of what I mean by that? So think of a sentence that says something like, it should be noted that, contrary to our expectations, the coefficients on x1 and x2 are significantly negative. There's a lot of extra verbiage in that sentence. You might have already told the reader what you expected to see because that's part of your hypothesis, so just say the coefficients on x1 and x2 are statistically significant and negative. That's all you really need to say. Right? When you have lots of those different sentences in a paper, it adds up to sort of a bulky sort of document that kind of distracts the reader from what you're really trying to say. So learn to write in a fairly tight fashion, and that alone is going to reduce the length of your document quite a bit. And as I said, the goal really should be a paper that's around 30 pages of text, and if it's an empirical paper, around 8 tables. And anything more than that is really starting to stretch the reader's ability to pay attention to what you're really doing. If you can't convey it in a pretty sharp fashion, then you probably need to think a little bit more about what you really have and what you don't have. a trick that a lot of people tend to do at first is just to shove a lot of things into footnotes. Don't do that. If it's important enough to say it probably belongs in the text, and things on footnotes ought to be just things like long lists of references that pertain to what you're saying in the passage. You really should never have more than an average of one footnote per page. You can make use of appendices, right? If it's some information that some readers might like to see but is not really essential to taking the reader along this linear path, that's the kind of thing that is useful to put in an appendix. And most of the journals now will have online appendices that can be posted. That's a little dangerous trend, I think, because authors tend to just put way too much in those online appendices at times. So you need to think about what needs to be in there. But that's a reasonable way to condense your document. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the introduction, right? Because in a lot of ways, the introduction is the most important part of your paper. As Vish was talking about before, people don't read papers anymore. In the sense that's true. They do read a lot of introductions, and the introduction, if it's really well done, will convince the reader that maybe they should read the whole paper. But if they don't, the introduction ought to convey pretty much everything that's in your paper. And that's not easy to do if you're thinking about doing it in a very tight fashion. Right? So what needs to be in this introduction? Well, first and foremost, it should be telling the reader, what are you doing? Right? And that's got to appear really early in the introduction. Certainly in the first page, but preferably in the first paragraph. Right? What you really don't want to get into is giving this long history of where the literature has been without saying what you're doing at all. Right? This is your paper. You need to be telling the reader what it is that you're doing. Now, you need to say a little bit about the literature up front because you need to convince the reader why this is an interesting topic, why it's important for them to learn the answer to the question that you're posing. So you got to convince the reader that it's interesting and important, but it shouldn't be done in a way that you're boring the reader with a litany of papers that other people have done. Keep the focus on what you're doing. So what are you doing? Why is it interesting and important? How are you going about doing this? What's your method? If it's an empirical paper, you've got some experimental design issues, spell them out. Tell the reader what they are in as concise a way as you can. Right? Fourth, what do you find? And fifth, how do you interpret those findings? Make sure that those two things are separated. And oftentimes when you ask somebody, what did they find? They give you their interpretation of their findings. And those are two distinct things. What you find, if you do an empirical paper, you find an association between variable A and variable B. How you interpret that, it might be open to multiple interpretations, and you have to recognize what those are and spell those out. And then finally, how does this relate to other findings in the field? This is where you bring in a little bit more of the literature, I think. But personally, I think it's more effective to leave this towards the end of the introduction. And once you've told the reader what it is you're doing, why it's an important question, right, they may be thinking in their mind, well, wait a second, didn't these other papers do some of this already? You need to tell them how your work differs from them. But this is not some lengthy literature review at the end of the introduction, but rather it should just be pointing to the 2 or 3 papers that are closest to what you're doing. And how your work is actually distinct from theirs or builds upon theirs or complements theirs. Right. Now, all that sounds like a lot to put in an introduction, so the goal may seem kind of counterintuitive, but you really should want to be able to communicate this in about 3 minutes. The only thing I think that really should stretch that out is number 6, depending on how much you feel necessary to say about how it relates to other findings in the field. But if you should be able to fairly concisely express what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, what you find, how you interpret it, in 3 pages or less. If you're not doing that, then you're probably not thinking hard enough about what it is you've got. Okay, some general do's and don'ts that I think are important in terms of writing. First, you really need to learn how to write in an agnostic fashion. Now, this is tricky in the sense that, you know, as Ish was saying earlier, in some sense, you're always marketing. I mean, you have to market your work in the sense that you have to convince people that what you're doing is important, that you've really got something. But you're not a salesperson. You're not a politician who's promoting a particular point of view. You're a scientist. You asked a question, right? You brought some evidence to bear on that question, or you were able to write down a theoretical model that addresses that question, and now you're reporting what you've got. You interpret it in an agnostic fashion, as anyone who doesn't have a stake in this might interpret this evidence. That's going to be a lot more convincing than having the reader think that you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes. Along those lines, very few papers work out exactly the way we envision them in our mind. We always have some priors. We always can see where the evidence seems to be pointing, but there's always some results that are a little bit weaker than we would like. And there's always some limitations to the approach that we took. No study is perfect. Don't try to hide those things. Go ahead and acknowledge what the limitations of your study are. And that's going to convey a much more positive impression to the reader than would be something that seems like you don't even recognize what the limitations are. So don't try to hide those things. I kind of said this already, but in terms of the introduction, but you want to get to your main result really quickly in the paper. If the reader's got to wait till table 7 or page 20 of your paper to get what's really your central finding, they're not going to get there. You have already lost them. They won't read that long. So, I mean, if you could do it in table 1, great. Most of the time it's more like table 2 or table 3 that's got the central finding, but really the only stuff that should come before the central finding are things that you think are essential for the reader to know in order for them to understand your central finding. Right? Anything else, just either take it out or move it to later in the paper. Don't ignore competing papers. Right? This is a tricky one sometimes for authors, especially young authors, when they see, it looks like somebody else is working on the same topic. Well, if I don't look at their paper, then I can't, I have to acknowledge that it exists, and maybe I can seem like I'm providing more of a contribution somehow. Don't do that. Referees, editors, they understand the literature. They will know if you somehow miss relevant papers in the literature, and it's going to happen sometimes, right, inadvertently. But if you know that there are competing papers out there, go ahead and say, maybe it's contemporaneously done and they're just happening in parallel. That's okay, that happens. But you need to acknowledge that they exist, and if your study is anything different in any way, point that out. Try to avoid as much as possible using adjectives in your work, like it's a really striking result, or the results in table 7 are very interesting. The reader can judge that for themselves as to what's interesting and what's striking or not. So you don't need to help them in that respect, and sometimes they get irritated if it looks like you're trying to help them too much. And lastly, make sure your paper is fairly carefully documented. If it's an empirical paper, it should be the type of thing that any other PhD student could pick it up and just go out and replicate what you did. If they can't do that, then you haven't really documented the paper as carefully as you can. Okay, now last thing I want to talk about is more just some practical suggestions for the process of writing. Because I said, writing is an important skill. It's not a skill that everyone has innately, but I think it is a skill like teaching that can be developed. It takes practice. You have to do it a lot. Like I said before, it's not the case that you just want to spend months and months on your data or your model and then a weekend writing it up. Right? What you really want to do is write very regularly, and ideally, I think, in consistent times and places. I can remember when I was finishing my PhD at Michigan, Harry D'Angelo joined the faculty, and Harry, if anyone read his papers, is a tremendous writer, I think. And he was promoting this point of view that you need to set aside a time in the day where you can have some uninterrupted time to write each and every day. You might be writing your paper, it might be writing up a new idea in sort of an outline form, but it's some sort of writing that you do. And, I'm sitting there as a PhD student agreeing with everything he said, nodding vigorously. And he said, so what I like to do is, I could get up around 4 every morning, because I find that between 4 and 6, it's really pretty quiet when you're betting it is. I thought, up to that point, I thought I was an early riser. But so my point is not get up at 4 a.m. because you can have uninterrupted time, but find that time that works for you, where you're not going to have interruptions to your time and you can get a lot done. It's really difficult, I think, to spend whole days on just writing. And even if I've listened on occasion to authors of, fiction authors talk about, how they do it, and I think, it doesn't seem like these guys work very much, because they talk about getting up in the morning and writing until noon, and then they're done for the day. Well, I think that's because you can't write for that long. So mix your writing with the other activities that go into research and ultimately teaching once you're on the job. You want to have a little block of time each day where you're doing your writing, but don't expect that you can just write all day. That won't be a very efficient use of your time. Along the lines that Mara said with respect to teaching, identify good writers in the field and try to emulate the way they do it. I think it's, all of you have probably read papers where you walked away from it and said, "Right, that was written really well." But go beyond that and ask yourself, well, what was good about it? Why do you think that this was written well? And the same thing with badly written papers. Right? There are some badly written papers out there, and you might be pulling your hair out, trying to understand what it was they're trying to say. But ask yourself after you read those papers, well, what is it about the way they did it that made it more difficult? That's really going to help your own writing, I think, to both emulate the good writers and to understand what doesn't work for some people. Get feedback from other people. Have people read what you've written. And I think it's even best sometimes to get people to read it who aren't in the narrow field in which you're working. And somebody who's informed enough to understand what it is you're doing, but who isn't working in that particular field, because they're a nice, fresh set of eyes that you're going to have to explain things very clearly to them so that they sort of get the path that works. And last and certainly not least, find what works for you. You do need to write regularly. You do need to practice this craft. There's not a one-size-fits-all on this. You have to understand your own personality in this field, whether it comes to writing or managing your time for teaching. So you do have to figure out ultimately what works best for you, and it's not necessarily the same thing that works for the person in the office next to you. So understand yourself and use that understanding to maximize what you get out of it. Okay, that's it. Questions? Yep.
So you mentioned in the introduction you need to say what is the difference between your research and other people's research. So is that the same as a literature review? Do you have a separate section for literature review?
I think that depends on the paper. I think it is different from the literature review in the sense that what you want to do in the introduction is really just focus on the 2 or 3 papers that are really closest to what you're doing. They speak directly to some of the issues that you talk about. There may be a prior literature that is useful to convey to the reader that sort of takes them on the path as to why these questions are now interesting. If so, I would say that that would be a separate literature review section that you'd want to put in this section.
Yes, I have a question. So do you have some suggestion for the conclusion part?
For the what?
Conclusion part.
Conclusion? Yeah, that's a good question. In a lot of ways, I think the conclusion is the least important part of the paper. Only because if you've written the paper well up to that point, you've already told the reader everything. And so the conclusion is, in that sense, somewhat redundant. Now, where the conclusion can be useful, though, is sort of positioning now, now that you've answered, you hope, this question that you posed, what's really the next step? Where will the literature go next? If you can sort of guide the reader in that sense, that's a useful thing to do in the conclusion, I think. But other than that, I think you want to keep the conclusion really pretty short and sweet. You sort of succinctly summarize what you've already told them.
We all know we could keep polishing our drafts forever. So what's the trigger point for you to say, well, now I'm done and I just want to send it out?
Well, that's always a tough one, by the way. And I think this is part of getting to know yourself. Because I see both ends of the spectrum with students that I've advised over the years. Some are just really eager, and you have to hold them back. They want to send it out way too early, way before it's really ready. And others that are more sort of the perfectionist personality, they kind of understand that no study is perfect, but they think theirs should be before they send it out, and so they never send out the paper. So that's the first step, I think, is to kind of understand where your limitation might be if you're too eager or too reticent to send it out. So what's that trigger point? I think you really should lean on others, senior advisors, to help you with that question, but essentially it comes down to the point at which you think there's really diminishing returns to these revisions. You're just not seeing it be all that different anymore, then it's probably time to ship it out. But others can and should give you some advice on that. Oh, sorry.
So how, when you are writing, how do you strike a balance between being humble and at the same time being proud of your research?
Well, I think that comes back to you having to be very agnostic about what you're doing. I mean, if you have to convey to the reader the importance of the question, right? And that has nothing to do with you personally. It's not a question of you being humble or not at that point. It's a question of whether this is an interesting question or not. And then beyond that, you're doing everything you can to answer that question and just reporting on what you found. So in that respect, if you think of yourself more as the scientist who's reporting what you found, then you don't have to deal as much with this issue.